Good morning, everyone. My name is Homa Huck, and I'm the Associate Director here of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of our President, Fred Kemp, and my colleagues at the Center, I'd like to welcome you all here this morning for a discussion on breakthrough or extension implications for U.S. and European relations with Iran. I'd also like to welcome our audience at home as this event is being live streamed. And so since it was launched in 2010 by then Senator Chuck Hagel and Ambassador Stuart Eisenstadt, the task force has sought to perform a comprehensive analysis of Iran's political landscape, as well as its role in the region and globally, to answer the question of whether there are elements within the country and region that can build a basis for an improved relationship with the West, and how these elements, if they exist, could be utilized by U.S. policymakers. And so over the course of the past year in particular, the task force has focused on ways of supporting the reinvigorated nuclear negotiations between Iran and the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany. And so the task force has done this through convening timely and public-private meetings like the one we're having today, through briefing the Iranian American community and staffers on Capitol Hill, and publishing issue briefs that propose pragmatic solutions to some of the most difficult issues in the negotiations. I would like to thank the Plowshares Fund for supporting us since the launch of the task force, which is led primarily by our senior fellow Barbara Slavin, and I'm going to actually turn it over to Barbara, and she's going to be introducing our speakers and moderating the discussion today. So thank you again for coming, and thank you to the Plowshares Fund.
Thanks so much, Emma, and thank you for those of you who braved the weather and came out today to be here in person. I want to begin with a few observations from on the talks themselves. I think a lot of us were surprised, frankly, that they didn't make more progress. There was kind of an expectation that the negotiators would get close to at least some sort of a framework agreement in Vienna, and instead, of course, we have a 7-month extension, which is a very long time, time in which all kinds of unpleasant things can happen, possible mischief, possible sabotage of talks, and of course, we're going to be talking about that in the discussion. On the plus side, however, Iran agreed to some new concessions in return for what seems to be a very modest amount of sanctions relief. They've agreed to convert another 35 kilograms of 20% oxide into reactor fuel, provide more access for the International Atomic Energy Agency to centrifuge production facilities, and limit research into more advanced centrifuges, and all of this for just another $5 billion in frozen oil revenues. One of the issues we want to explore is whether the game plan has somehow changed from reaching a comprehensive agreement to indefinite extensions of the interim agreement that was reached last year. I know that our speakers have some interesting thoughts on that topic. So let me introduce them briefly, and then we will proceed to the discussion. First, we're very pleased to have Cliff Kupchan with us. He's chairman of the Eurasia Group, practice head for Eurasia and Iran director, and he provides top-level analysis on global macro issues, Russia's domestic and foreign policies, Iran's nuclear and foreign policies, domestic politics, and international sanctions on Iran and Russia. Prior to joining the Eurasia Group in 2005, Cliff served in the State Department as Deputy Coordinator of U.S. Assistance to Eurasia during the Clinton administration. He also worked for the House International Relations Committee. And more recently, he was Vice President and Senior Fellow at the Center for National Interest. From 2000 to 2002, he lived in Moscow and was Vice President of the Eurasia Foundation, leading programmatic and fundraising efforts for one of the leading foundations in Russia. Then we're very pleased to have, this time in person, Cornelius Adebar. Cornelius wrote an excellent study on how sanctions by the European Union against Iran could be eased. And this was a paper that we put out along with a companion piece on easing U.S. sanctions against Iran back in June. And hopefully we have some copies outside, and also you can find this paper on our website. Cornelius is a political analyst and entrepreneur based in Washington, D.C. and in Berlin, working on European foreign policy in its broadest sense. He's an associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he runs the endowment's Europe program. He's also an associate fellow of the Research Institute of the German Council on Foreign Relations. From 2011 to 2013, he lived in Tehran, working with the EU presidency and teaching at Tehran University. Before that, he was also a lecturer at the Willy Brandt School of Public Policy at Erfurt University and a member of the Team Europe of the European Commission. And finally, I'm delighted to have Eric Ferrari. He's a lawyer whose main area of practice is assisting clients in complying with and addressing issues related to U.S. trade sanctions. He is an encyclopedia when it comes to Iran sanctions. He works extensively on issues arising before the Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, the infamous OFAC. He has extensive experience on how U.S. sanctions impact U.S.-Iran trade, particularly in the realm of humanitarian trade, which has been a focus for the Iran Task Force here for several years. And he also works on removing names from OFAC's specially designated nationals list. He helps get OFAC licenses to engage in transactions otherwise prohibited by OFAC, and he's developed and implemented OFAC compliance programs for international companies. He writes actively on these issues, and he's the founder and author of a blog, www.sanctionlaw.com. He's also pretty active on Twitter. So we're going to make this informal. I'm going to go and sit down. And we're going to start with Cliff Kupchan. Cliff, I want to get your reflections on what happened last week or didn't happen last week in Vienna. Were you surprised at the long extension? And do you think that there is still reason for optimism? Because I noticed that there are sunny remarks coming out from various negotiators talking about progress made and how close they got, but a 7-month extension doesn't suggest that they're really close.
Yeah, I share your opening remarks, your frustration, Barbara. I expected a framework agreement. They didn't get one. There's lots of upbeat talk from reporters and from some diplomats who were there. I don't really know about what. I mean, maybe it was, we'll talk about it, the restrictions on advanced machines, which is big, but limited. Otherwise, I don't know what they're so excited about. Maybe it was a bit of hostage syndrome. You're there for so long, you just get excited when you get to leave your hostage, your hostage taker. On enrichment, one of the bellwether issues, we know the U.S. wants a year breakout time. There are 3 components of that: fewer machines, getting rid of the LEU stockpile, and putting machines that aren't being used into remote storage. And from what I hear, Iran was yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. They'd agree to 2, they wouldn't agree to the 3rd, then they'd agree to another one, but they'd back
Slow down. So the Iranians agreed to...
Sorry, they agreed to nothing. But if you want to be blunt about it, but what they would agree to is 2 of the 3 prongs, but not the 3rd prong.
Okay.
Then they'd switch the prong that they didn't agree to. And it was kind of like nailing Jello to the wall, is my understanding of the enrichment negotiation, but they clearly didn't get there. And that was a big deal, I think, in not getting to a framework agreement. The second big deal in not getting to a framework agreement was the sanctions relief issue, which I'm perplexed by. Iran is, of September, was saying that they didn't need a lot of upfront relief. They do it on waivers and suspensions, mainly from the U.S. Then all of a sudden, they needed all the UN resolutions repealed as an ironclad condition of a final agreement, and that's a non-starter. For many reasons, primarily because it's the UN resolutions that stop Iran's illicit procurement channel of nuclear and ballistic missile-related goods. So I think what happened is that, and you add duration of constraints in PMD, is there wasn't enough progress to justify a framework agreement in the end. The only real progress that was made, you referred to earlier, the IR-2M, I think the IR-4, though that's not been out there, IR-5, IR-6, IR-8, all the advanced machines cannot be developed in a way that would make them capable of industrial production. And that's a big concession. I think the other 2, there's less than meets the eye, frankly. The inspections were doubled from once a month to twice a month. I mean, I don't know, that doesn't get me too excited. Yes, Iran's going to go down to 40 kilograms of 20%, but a lot of the stuff is going to be left in an intermediate state, which could be reconverted to usable. So I don't think they got all, one big thing and nothing else is my view of where we are. So in essence, they just didn't make enough progress why is a different issue, but go ahead.
Cliff, was it still the issue of centrifuge numbers, of a reluctance on the part of Iran to reduce the numbers? I mean, my sense was they thought when they agreed to send out stockpiles of low-enriched uranium to Russia, that they thought that was going to be the magic solution, which would allow them to keep 10,200 centrifuges spinning away.
Well, yeah, that's the Zarif plan. I don't know that they ever really agreed to get rid of the LEU. It's been reported that they did in a tentative way. I don't know.
I mean, I'd also heard that they would go down slightly to reduce the separative work units. We're getting really into the weeds here, but still wanted to keep the same. I mean, it's almost as though for purposes of face, or this was the red line set by the Supreme Leader, they had to keep those existing machines still in place. Was that also your impression, that there just was no budging on that?
I think that's right, and I also don't think that they had come to terms on what you do with the machines that aren't being used. If you just depipe them and leave them in place, the reconstitution capability is very quick. If you depipe them, remove them, and take them, into somebody's backyard 200 miles away, then you've got a lot more time. It's much more bulletproof for reconstitution. But look, again, the thing that left a lot of people with glee is that everybody knows what everybody else's bottom line is. Well, if that took a year, we're in real trouble. I think the bottom line in my view is two. First, Supreme Leader Khamenei, either Iran did not have the political will to agree to a deal that was doable. Whether that was because he wanted a better deal later, wasn't willing to bite the bullet on this offer, didn't think he could sell the offer, I don't know. But I think they knew all the way along, for at least the last 6 months, what the best the market was going to give them, the political market was going to give them, and they just said no. So we don't have the political will yet in Iran. On the U.S. side, Obama's really hemmed in, mostly by the Congress. He's got to stick to a year's breakout time. I don't think he can go far down on machines because the Congress will just say no and pass legislation over it. So there's a political will versus a domestic constraint problem, and I think that led to a roadblock.
Okay. I'm going to come back to Congress in a little bit, but let me turn to Cornelius. What's your sense from talking to European diplomats? Were they surprised that they didn't get farther? Are they at all optimistic that they can meet? They've set a deadline now for March, again, for some sort of political agreement, but it's a very, very soft deadline, and obviously they've given themselves until July. What's your sense from the Europeans?
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you for having me. Thank you for putting together this discussion. I'm very happy I can sit in the room and not be on the screen as last time I had to be. When it comes to Europe, there was an element of surprise, but also certainly an element of relief, because there is a feeling. Going back in history, the Europeans had started these talks nearly 12 years ago, and they want these talks to succeed at some point. It could have been last week. It should have been last week, of course. But they rather keep on talking and keep the level, the status quo that we have reached with the interim agreement, than see it fail completely. So the idea that there is not the dichotomy that some people made out, no deal or a bad deal, and some say better one than the other, the Europeans were relieved that the talks can at least continue, that the US is serious in getting to a deal, that it's not a make or break situation now, running the risk of what happens if there is a break. When it comes to perceptions, I can only say that there is much less of a debate still in Europe about this. There was no groundswell of op-eds before and after November 24. You can really, you have to look for op-eds on the Iran file. The general mood is here, but it's much less pronounced. That's what I'm saying. There is a view that the Iranians have been intransigent. They need to come up, as Cliff said, the political will was lacking, obviously. There has been so much talk being done about what is on offer and what is realistic, also toning down expectations, maybe too high expectations on the European side. But it's clearly obvious that this was not done, the deal could not be had because the Iranians didn't agree to it. Why such a long extension? Because if one were close, one could have said, let's give us a few more weeks, let's do it before Christmas, let's do it before the Persian New Year, 21st
Before the new
of
Congress
March.
comes in.
Before, well, that's like Christmas, isn't it? But yeah, one could have gone, or the opposite. I was speaking about time. But one could have gone in a much shorter time frame. To an extent, I feel that what I hear is that the Iranians still want something to be done in a shorter time frame. I wonder how they want to achieve this themselves. But that the P5+1 decided, okay, if we need to go for an extension, we don't want it to be 2 or 3 months and then not achieve a success again, but then we give us more time. It's not 7 months. They want a framework agreement within 4 months and then have 3 more months for technical talks. This gets lost usually in the public perception, which is true, which is maybe because people are banking on a 7 months extension and not a 4 months. So there is this whole idea of we'll have to get there eventually. Let's give us enough time. But in the end, we've rolled it over twice now. We've rolled it over end of July. We've rolled it over end of November. It's not the end of the world if we somehow keep rolling over it. Even Israel is now in favor of the current situation. It was not about a year ago, exactly a year ago. Now they seem to prefer the status quo than anything else because they know that they don't get what they want. I mean, no one gets what they want in these kind of negotiations. So that's the mix of feelings that comes from Europe.
Okay. Eric, let me talk to you about the sanction situation and how this affects the calculations of various business people and also just ordinary Iranian Americans who are trying to do transactions of one sort or another with Iran, trying to get money out of the place, trying to send money there, trying to send humanitarian goods and so on. Has there been an appreciable improvement in that situation since the interim agreement was reached a year ago, and do you anticipate that things will continue to be smoother? I mean, the Treasury Department said that they finally put in place a reliable channel in May, at least for Iran to get some of its oil revenues. I don't know if that really has been applied to humanitarian trade, perhaps for some of the big companies, but not for the small players. So take a crack at that if you would.
Sure. Thank you for the question, and thank you to Atlantic Council for having me here today. As far as improvement, I would say no. There's been increased interest by U.S. businesses who are seeking to position themselves in the event of a comprehensive agreement between the P5+1 and Iran. As far as the Iranian American community dealing with divestment issues, seeking to fundraise on behalf of charities in Iran, these types of activities, they're still facing the same problem that everyone else is facing. And when I say everyone else, I mean everyone from international businesses to U.S. businesses and so forth, is the banking situation. This is obviously a topic you've written on and that Atlantic Council has reported on. But the inherent defect in sanctions is that you are deputizing the private sector to carry out a foreign policy function. And the private sector, particularly the financial services industry, does not care about foreign policy. They care about risk policy. So when they have a transaction presented to it, they say, okay, what's the bottom line here? What do we anticipate we will make on this? What is it going to cost us in overhead, man hours for compliance?
Sure.
And what is our risk exposure? And these answers, unfortunately, are not coming up in favor of increased trade with Iran. I recently sat down with a friend of mine who does a lot of compliance for large-scale financial institutions, major international banks, and I asked him, what is your opinion about the bank's position if there's a comprehensive deal? He shrugged. He said they're not going to rush back to Iran. There's too much risk exposure. There's significant fines that have come out in the past few years, and you're dealing in a strict liability regime, meaning if you make a mistake, it doesn't matter if you're operating in good faith. There may be mitigating circumstances which minimize the penalty, but you've still made a violation. And not to mention there's still reputational risk. So I haven't seen any improvement, and if I was sitting in Iran's position, that's one of the things I would be considering. How is the international financial system going to respond to to offered sanctions relief?
Okay. Cliff, I want to go back to you and talk about Congress a little bit. We have seen statements, certainly, since the midterm elections by a number of people, Mark Kirk, others, Lindsey Graham, that they intend to kill the Iran negotiations, that they are determined to pass new sanctions. People are very concerned that there might even be a veto-proof majority in the Senate, 67, to actually pass new sanctions if there is not a comprehensive deal. And yet we have this countervailing sense, you know, the Israelis, who are obviously very active in terms of their influence on Capitol Hill, seemingly satisfied by rolling over the interim agreement. How long can President Obama stave off new sanctions? Can he get 7 months, really? And you know, what happens if new sanctions get passed with a veto-proof majority?
I don't think we're as close to new congressional sanctions as a lot of people do. If you try to count heads, and it's hard to count heads of a Congress that's not sitting yet, but the Republicans will have about 52 firm yeses. Senator Flake and Senator Paul are not going to vote for sanctions. That means they need 8 Democrats for cloture and for passage of a bill. They can probably get that. Mm-hmm. But that means they need 15 hard Democratic votes to get an override. And I don't think I know the Republicans don't think they can get that. So something's got to change in order for them to be able to impose a new sanctions bill. Now, March could do that. If there's no framework by March, I think an override becomes a lot more possible. It depends on the dynamics. I mean, Cornelius makes a good point, but I think they could blow through that March framework agreement deadline just like water. I mean, I think it's a 7-month extension. You know, sure. I mean, you know, these guys are, you know, they're pretty good politicians. You know, March is one flashpoint, but right now, I think the threat from Congress is overstated. Congressional patience, I think, will run out by July. But I think they probably got 7 months, and that's a long time. You know, I think any reasonable person will ask, if you can't do it in a year and 7 months, then what are you doing?
I wanted to ask you also, because you're a Russia hand, you know, we see a lot of reports in the news about deals between Russia and Iran, swaps of oil, and ways, certainly deals that look like they might violate sanctions agreements. Yeah. Is any of this real? Is there a real plan B there for Iran in terms of focusing on those countries that are still willing to trade with it? And could the sanctions regime that we have in place now erode over time?
Well, first, I think the sanctions regime we have now is quite robust. The bedrock of sanctions is the U.S. and the EU, and they're not going anywhere. Okay. I mean, nobody else really matters. I mean, you know, so you know, just you got a choice between the Iranian market and the U.S. market. What are you going to do? I mean, let me think for a while. You know, so that's the sanctions regime. Russia. Man, I was just in a meeting with Mr. Putin about 3 weeks ago, and man, he's in a bad mood. You know, so they would love to find a way to slap the U.S. You know, I've heard lots of versions, including from guys who are apparently writing this stuff. There's an MOU, but it's not public. One version is oil for goods, and that obviously is sanctions busting and would be a real problem for the sanctions regime. The other version is goods for money, that they just engage in you know, more or less the legal non-oil trade. Mm-hmm. Help Iran, maybe get sanctioned a little bit, but not much. And that's the other version that I've heard, both from the Iranians and the Russians. On balance, I don't think we're close to a sanctions busting deal. What I think is under-recognized, you know, in the press, or missed in the press, is that in my view, the Russians are arguably, if not among the most creative, constructive members of the P5+1. The LEU deal came from Russia. The Russians have been leading like hell on the Iranians. So Russia's really in, and why they'd queer really the one arena right now where they, you know, have a good reputation, where they're really playing an appreciated constructive role, except in this country where nobody's going to appreciate them for anything. I mean, I just don't think they're about to jump ship. In short, it's a threat over the medium term. I don't think it's a short and near-term threat.
Okay. Cornelius, do you share Cliff's optimism about the EU holding fast? You don't think there'll be any cracks there?
Right, definitely. I mean, I share the optimism. I was surprised to see some op-eds even here. I think Washington Post just alluding to the fact how easy it is to ease EU sanctions, which it is, which we wrote about. But they would not do this without the political framework. I mean, the Europeans and the Americans are so firm on this. They have been over years. There is no appetite whatsoever on the European side to go against the US. Certainly not against the US government position. There are issues with how Congress sees this, but as long as the US can hold firm to its side of the deal, the Europeans are going to stick to it. They have no interest, as Cliff said, the choice between, it's not just the market for the Europeans, it's an alliance with the Americans, or going to Iran for whatever type of business. It's not even a choice. It's made. It's obvious where the Europeans stand. So what we may see is, out of a particular situation in Brussels now, where we have a new leadership, Federica Mogherini, who's the new High Representative who succeeded Catherine Ashton as the High Representative, not yet as the leader of the P5+1 talks. She may want to put more of an emphasis on her leadership. She may take a new view on the Iran file. She may want to get involved, actually, after now that we're extending for such a long time. So there may be some movements on the European side, but not on these fundamentals, certainly not.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit, and Eric, maybe you can come in on this, about the economic situation in Iran now. Two factors: the fact that they did not get a comprehensive deal last week, and of course the precipitous drop in oil prices. I mean, oil is under $70 a barrel now, has led to a run on the real again. The latest information is, let's see, the real is at about 35,000 reals to the dollar, which is a big drop. That's close to the worst it reached under Ahmadinejad, yeah, or worse actually, because let's see, it was 36,000, yeah, just before Hassan Rouhani was elected president, the real dropped to 36,000 to the dollar. Now it's at 35,000 to the dollar. Iran has seen some growth again. It's no longer in recession. Inflation has come down, but otherwise the picture isn't that robust. So, what do you think this is going to mean in terms of, Iranian policy in these talks? Can they continue to go on like this with the real collapsing, with oil prices as low as they are, and with access to such a limited amount of their frozen revenues?
Do I think they can survive? Yes, at least for 7 months, certainly. They've been very creative in the past at surviving. As someone who deals with a number of Iranian businessmen, they find very unique ways to pay for and obtain products that they need. I do think it impacts their analysis from the perspective of they have a number of different contemporary political events that they could be leveraging in these talks. For example, ISIS is a big one. The U.S.'s situation vis-a-vis Russia right now is another one. But as the economy is impacted, they start to lose some of that leverage they were gaining because of geopolitical events occurring around the world. So the answer is yes, I think they can survive. They will be creative enough to get at least those basic goods they need. But it certainly is going to impact their analysis overall, because as the economy slips, people at home start getting upset. There's discontent amongst the business community that plays out politically within Iran at a time like this. So I think they're losing leverage as the economy suffers.
Of course, we should point out that even though the price of oil is dropping, Iran has no access to its current oil revenues. I just clarified that this morning with the Treasury Department. Iran gets $700 a month under the. $700 billion a month. Million. Yes, hello. Still a little jet lagged. $700 million a month for a total of $5 billion over the 7 months. But the money that it's amassing for its oil sales, such as they are, go into accounts in foreign banks in places like Japan and China and South Korea and Turkey and India, and are frozen there. It is the P5+1 that decides exactly how much Iran gets each month, and it's a rather measly amount. So I'll put it to you, Cliff. Do you think that this rather small sanctions relief plus the drop in oil prices and so on, gives leverage to finally get to a deal? Or do you think the Iranians will just continue to muddle through?
I don't think it'll be decisive. I still think a deal will rise or fall on the merits of the deal. On balance, it marginally, I think, helps. I think Eric implied the prospects for a deal, but I think this is going to rise or fall on centrifuges and sanctions relief. My understanding is that the Iranian oil price in the next Persian calendar year budget is $76. They have $70 billion in the National Development Fund.
That's not frozen.
That's not frozen. That's in Iran.
Okay.
They are talking about budget slashing. They have tremendous coercive power in the Basij and the IRGC. So I don't think Khamenei thinks he's in a lot of trouble. It's also my understanding, and I'm not a banker, that the CBI, the central bank, issues money to the government against the escrow accounts.
Okay.
So they still are sensitive to the price of oil, and they can float the budget depending on the price of oil. So they are in some trouble, but I don't think it'll have a material bearing on the outcome of the talks.
One last question for you, and then I'm going to open it up. What are the projections for the price of oil going forward? Do people think it's going to go below 60? Or?
Depends on who your bookie is. Look, the key variable is Saudi. Will the Saudis cut? Mm-hmm. Well, there are the first four variables in order of importance to the Saudi. The fifth is the Libyan security situation. We think about 500,000 barrels a day of Libyan crude will come off, which will provide some support. But the Saudis didn't cut on Thursday. Mm-hmm. It's our view that sort of the cost benefit for Saudi doesn't work if oil goes much lower, and the Saudis will eventually cut. So that for 2015, we still see oil in the $80 range, which leaves these countries, again, goes to the sort of, it's a supportive factor for a deal, but where we see oil going, Iran's not going to be in enough trouble that it's going to be that eager for a deal.
Okay, let me open up to the audience. Raise your hand, say who you are, wait for the microphone. Greg, if you could, let's see. Thanks, yeah. Get a microphone.
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. A couple of you already mentioned the March deadline as not being particularly significant. It's the 7th month that really kicks in. A specific date was mentioned, March 1st. That's less than 3 months away. What was the purpose of that? And is that not a substitute for what was really expected at the end of last month, that is a political agreement with some of the details to be worked out later? I just wondered what you think the meaning of that March date is.
Cornelius, you want to grab that?
I take it as an expression that what I refer to, that the Iranians actually want a deal much earlier, the framework deal. The Iranian New Year celebrations are on March 21st, so way ahead of them. I mean, they have at least some good news that they hopefully can present to their people. This is of essence for them. If you just look at the way domestic politics are constructed, it has significant meaning to be able to say, ahead of such an event where all the families come together, where all the families want to spend money, to be able to say the prospects have bettered. We are now in good shape. There is money coming in. There is the prospect of a comprehensive deal. So that's how I take it, that there is some hope, at least on the Iranian side, to be able to close the deal earlier. I don't take it as a strict deadline, March 1st and not March 2nd, but early March would be good to have a comprehensive, a political framework at the latest. That's how I take it.
For what it's worth, Iranian officials have told me that prolonging this negotiating process, as far as they're concerned, is not in their interest. I mean, that is what I've consistently heard from them for the last few months.
And if we look at the interim deal, we also assess that it's not so much in their interest to keep these conditions that we have at the moment.
Exactly, yeah. Lady here?
Lieutenant Colonel Sylwia Szafowska from the Polish Defense Attaché Office. I have two questions. First, regarding to the enrichment. What red lines do you see for both sides in terms of future negotiations in this particular area? And the second one, do you think that there could be a deal on the number of centrifuges if it is agreed that it will be more modern ones with this higher SWU capacity, like either 5 or 6? Thank you.
Cliff, why don't you grab that?
Yeah, I mean, anything with advanced generation machines is going to have to be phased in, and that's the real challenge now that Iran has temporarily agreed to stop, for all intents and purposes, development. But anybody who's been there knows it's tremendously proud people who are extremely proud of their scientific prowess with good reason, and that's not going to be a 20-year commitment by Iran. So the real challenge now is when can they phase in from the IR-2M to the IR-8 or whatever. I do think there's a deal to be had, but you know, it's an ugly deal. All deals are ugly by the very definition of a deal. It's pretty ain't a deal, right? So it kind of works like this. As I look at the numbers, and there's lots of numbers out there, so what you kind of got to do, at least as a non-physicist, is look at the range of numbers and get a feel for where things are. I think at 6,000 machines, this pretty much works, and very limited stockpiles of 3% and 20%. You get breakout times of 9 to 12 months, so it works at 6. The LEU stockpile would have to come way down to 500 kilograms or less, and Iran would have to take the rest of its machines, not destroy them, but put them at a remote location. So I think it can be done, but it involves both sides breaking their red lines, which again, I think the president could probably sell 6 if it was a year breakout time, if everything else were in place. How many 2? I mean, it is something short of it's not a totalitarian state, period, but how many's got a lot of power? I don't know, that's the answer.
It would certainly be a good gift for Iranian New Year. Yes, gentleman here, just wait for the mic.
This question is actually for Cornelius.
And could you give your name, please?
My name is Chris Dugan. I work for Goddard Global. We're a PR agency worldwide. So I've been watching this with great interest over the past few years because the British press and the European press report events there very differently than the US press. A view from on the ground. We're up here at the policy level. What's happening on the ground in Tehran since you lived there? And what is the view and the political, we talk about the political will, and what is going to be the tipping point where the current administration will have popular support, or should we say...
This administration?
Yeah, this administration will have the political will, as in the Iranian administration, to go ahead.
Well, the view in Tehran was upbeat when I was there last in early October. People were expecting a deal. Ironically, they were expecting a deal because they were expecting the US to back down. The feeling there is prevalent that Iran has given so much already in the negotiations, and that there is a view that President Obama needs a foreign policy success, so at the end, he will make a deal. That was the expectation very much there when I was there. The economy had stabilized ever since we were there. I know when the dollar was at 36,000, but most recently, of course, there has been a slide again. But there was a feeling that if there is no deal, it will be the fault of the West. we keep talking now, so that's partly safe. But if there were even a failure of the negotiations, it would be because the West doesn't make concessions, because the U.S. doesn't make concessions, because Congress is so critical. So even on the Iranian side, they differentiate between the U.S. government and Congress, which is a level of knowledge which probably wasn't there before. Right now, it's difficult to say because, as I said before, there is an expectation from the Iranian public that there will be a deal. I do see a lot of support for the Iranian negotiators, and even if there were to be a failure in the end, it wouldn't be Zarif's or Rouhani's fault. They would be lauded as national heroes. They gave the best they could. These are all well-educated, well-mannered people. If these people are not able to strike a deal with the West, whoever could do so. So the idea that Iran can only, and certainly Khamenei as the supreme leader, he can only emerge victorious from this. Either he can proclaim victory because there is a deal, or he will feel vindicated because there is no deal, and that's because the West is so dead against Iran. So that at a rhetorical level, they've fixed it to this outcome that whatever turns out to be, it will be beneficial for Iran.
I would just disagree slightly, just judging from the reactions of people that I know there and so on. They were really disappointed that there was not a comprehensive agreement. And there are a lot of people who've just been, living on the prospect of this getting resolved, and then it's never resolved. So I think the government does pay a price. And I think there's a limit to how far Khamenei, to what extent he can be out of sync with the sentiment of his own people. It's a volatile, rather young population. Pop star passed away at a young age recently, and there were tens of thousands of people out on the streets. People are ready to come out, and better for the government to have them come out in celebration or, of something rather than the reverse. So I think they do have to be careful about how far they push it.
If I just can add to this, they have prepared for the two scenarios, the success and the failure. The one which we currently have, the rollover, the maybe continuous rollover, is something they're not so well prepared for, because this is difficult to sell. Because it's the in limbo state that they would have difficulties to explain to the Iranian people, why are we not getting the deal? Why is it not that we can blame the US for the failure, or why don't we get the sanctions relief that we wanted? So maybe from that perspective, rolling over, keeping the interim is maybe not too bad, because it's the one situation where the Iranian regime has a problem dealing with.
Gulf, I wanted to ask you also about the impact of those who are not in the room. We've mentioned Israel, that Israel seems fairly happy with the fact that there isn't a bad deal. Of course, for the Israelis, almost anything would be a bad deal. And that the interim deal keeps these restraints on the Iranian program. What about the Saudis? I noticed that John Kerry was having extensive conversations with the Saudi foreign minister in Paris, and then Saud al-Faisal actually came to Vienna and was sort of there on the margins. Is that another inhibiting factor when it comes to any kind of further concessions on the part of the P5+1? Or was it just a way of keeping him abreast of what was going on in the room?
I think it was more informational. Unlike the Israelis, in my view, for the Saudis, there's no good deal. There's just no good deal.
Well, the same good deal for the Saudis would be the good deal for the Israelis, namely no Iranian nuclear program, but that's not going to happen.
But I think these, having been to Israel a lot in the last 2 years, I don't talk to Bibi, but the rest of them, we get them all outside of camera, they're not crazy. If they can really constrain this program and keep it under wraps and have great eyes and ears on the ground, they'll not support a deal, but they'll keep very extremely quiet about it. For the Saudis, this is a blood feud. I mean, this is just, in my own view, if you look at the relationship recently, the invective has really been coming from the Saudis. I really think Rouhani and Zarif want to, they get it. This isn't working so well for either side. But the Saudis, possibly because the transition is going on, nobody's really made it. It just keeps, this invective just keeps coming out. And I don't think the Saudis are going to be supportive of any deal at all. On the other hand, the Saudis don't have much influence at all in this political process. I mean, arguably, Bibi Netanyahu is the most powerful member of the United States Congress. You can't say that about any Saudi.
Yeah, although he may be facing new elections soon. Yes, this gentleman here.
Thank you. Jacob Vader with Japan's Yomiuri Shimbun. How do you see Khamenei backing down from his public commitment to 190,000 centrifuges for Iran's enrichment capacity? Thanks.
He doesn't really have to, does he? I mean, there was no time limit put on his, he said at some point Iran needs to have 190,000 SWU, separative work units, very impressive for the Supreme Leader to even know the term. But he did not say when. So the question is, at what point does Iran get to build up to that level? How fast can they build up to that level? Cornelius, do you see that? I mean, I think the Supreme Leader can sell a deal very easily. The question is, does he want the comprehensive deal because of the other implications it would bring for U.S.-Iran reconciliation? I mean, it would be seen as such a huge breakthrough. Does he want a breakthrough, or is he more comfortable with this sort of, tacit understanding that kind of keeps the heat down on the dispute between the United States and Iran, but never quite gets there?
Well, certainly he doesn't want a breakthrough that leads to this rapprochement between the US and Iran. I mean, enmity with the United States is ingrained in the Islamic Republic's policy, in the constitution, in the being of the Islamic Republic. So there is nothing to be had in terms of an evolving friendship between the Americans and the Iranians under this particular regime. So if there were a deal, it wouldn't be hailed as a breakthrough that now leads to more cooperation on other issues. It would be strictly within the limits about which they are talking at the moment. It's the nuclear program, it's the recognition of Iran's right, as they see it, to enrich uranium, to be fully recognized, time-bound as a non-nuclear weapon state, to have the same rights and responsibilities, and to have those illegitimate, as they say, sanctions lifted. This is what they want, and this is what they would sell. And they wouldn't sell it as, now we become friends with the US. So that's part of how they perceive it. And that's where I would say, yes, 190,000 SWU, this is what he's mentioned, but it's easy, as you say, it's easy to pursue this as an end goal. It reminds me of a discussion that was also had here in Washington, maybe earlier this year, where people tried to frame the whole idea differently, that not what is considered as the breakout capacity would be decisive, but the practical needs of Iran. Flipping the whole discussion on its head, saying we're not trying to prevent something from happening, but we're strictly looking at what is it that Iran needs. And it may turn out that for the moment they need much less than what we consider a breakout capacity, because they have so much. They have fuel being delivered from Russia. But it's the idea of, if at the end we could come to a discussion of Iran only produces what it needs, and it has stockpiles which are limited and which are under safeguards, that would turn the whole debate around, and we wouldn't only be focusing on how can we prevent a bomb, but how can Iran have a program which is, as I said, commensurate with its needs, but it doesn't even produce enough uranium which could be diverted for other uses.
Do you agree that they're not looking for reconciliation? I mean, I also remember at the UN earlier this year, Hassan Rouhani said repeatedly that if there's a comprehensive nuclear deal, the relationship between the US and Iran will be completely different. And he was certainly suggesting that there would be much more discussion of Syria, of Iraq, the Islamic State, that this was going to really open the door. Was he just playing with us, and this was never something in the cards?
No, I think it depends on who they is. And I think there's a huge mistake made in the West, especially in this country, in assuming that Iran is monolithic, like Saddam Hussein's Iraq was monolithic. It's just not. I mean, there are lots of judiciary, Majlis, Expediency Council, Guardian Council. Hamidi is a primus inter pares. He is the leader, but he's not a dictator. I just don't think he's what, as a political scientist, I would call a garden variety dictator. He's a consensus builder. He's a weak leader in many ways. And you know, I think he's got the last word, but he's got to build consensus around the last word. So I think Rouhani would like a much more expansive relationship. I think it's right that everything I know about the leader. He's an ideologue. He believes that enmity towards the United States is a pillar of his power, and he wants nothing to do with reconciliation. I think what I've heard from Iranians is that there would not be an initial reconciliation, but there's not a risk, but a probability that what I call the happy virus would break out. You know, you wouldn't have it immediately, but you'd have more cooperation. Afghanistan, I mean, there's just so much low-hanging fruit. Iraq is more complicated. But there are ISIS. There are lots of issues where these countries' interests really do align. And you know, I think that would likely happen whether they want it or not.
You talk a lot to the financial sector in Iran. Obviously, the people who, particularly in the private sector, want this to happen. How much influence do you think they have?
From what I hear from them, the influence and the partnership between public and private is not as significant as it is here. I think they are very supportive of anything that is good for the overall government. They don't, at least not with me, in communications which may or may not be monitored, are coming out against the government. They're certainly saying if something is good for the government overall and for the country overall, then we are in support of that. That said, they would like to see more opportunity for trade to occur, for correspondent relationships to be set up with outside banks, and really a return to what they had not so long ago. If you look pre-2010 at some of the major private financial institutions in Iran, they may have had 35 to 40 correspondent banking relationships. Now that number is down below half a dozen for many of those banks. So while there's optimism around the prospect of a deal and renewed relationships, at least financially, they're also very supportive of what their government does.
I don't think they have much choice in that.
Right.
Katerina, wait for the microphone.
Katerina Peterson, Bank of Tokyo, Mitsubishi UFJ. I would like to ask the panel about what other options are there for congressional action other than sanctions that could affect the negotiations or a deal, and what can Congress do to, say, obstruct funding on the implementation of a deal?
Do you want to start?
Sounds like a legal question. I think, honestly, sky's the limit for Congress. They're creative, and that creativity is not always used in the most, in the best way possible. I could see them attaching provisions into spending bills that may have negative consequences for the deal. One idea that's been floated around is Congress actually seeking to pass legislation that would set a bottom line as far as what sanctions relief could be provided, saying that if the administration were to go beyond this in terms of granting sanctions relief, there could be additional sanctions forthcoming. That's an idea.
Is this a monetary figure, or what do you mean by a bottom line on
This
sanctions
is such an
relief?
idea that it hasn't been actually described as sanctions relief. This is just one of those kind of abstract concepts that's floating around this town right now. But that's another possibility, that Congress could set some sort of bar in relation to that. I think Congress, although doing quite a bit of saber rattling here, is also conscious of the fact that their actions and what they say and what they do could potentially sink the deal. Just as much as they're concerned about a bad deal, well, maybe not as much as they're concerned about a bad deal, but they're certainly conscious of that fact. I also think, and this is now I'm starting to go out on a tangent, so I'll stop after this point, but you were really wading into a separation of powers issue here. The executive is charged with carrying out the foreign policy functions of this country, and Congress is really starting to weigh in heavily and try to throw their weight around in that realm. And I wonder when that's going to come to a head. And that's an idea that's not mine alone, but shared by some other practitioners, legal practitioners in this area as well.
Cliff, what do you think Congress has up its sleeve? I've also read that there might be efforts to defund the IAEA, which seems incredibly
crazy,
stupid,
yeah.
but there we go.
I mean, there is a piece of legislation out there, the Corker bill, and he's now the chairman, which would mandate an up or down vote by both houses of Congress. And if both houses disapprove of the agreement, funding for implementation is cut off. Now, intuitively, but I would have to defer to Eric, intuitively I believe that's where the separation of powers issues would start to kick in. I don't know. I mean, I worked on the Hill for 10 years and wrote these bills, but I don't know how you get the constitutional authority to defund implementation, to not let the State Department allocate any funding for implementation. But that's a legal question.
Right, and that's one of the concerns I had and why I raised that point. It's not an issue that I've looked into particularly closely, but that's a concern that's being put out there and shared by a lot of people commenting, at least from a legal perspective, on these issues.
And of course, the IAEA performs many functions that go way beyond the monitoring of the Iranian compliance with its safeguards agreements. So it seems particularly short-sighted and self-defeating. Any other questions out here? Yeah, gentleman here.
Hi, Seamus Brennan with Democracy Council. I hear a sentiment often in the Iranian American community that specific elements within the regime, particularly IRG, benefit, or there's a perceived benefit from rent capturing. And I'm curious as to how you see that playing out in the negotiations and how the negotiators on the Iranian side are factoring that sort of hardline spoiler element into their negotiating position.
I don't know who wants to take it, but my impression is that the IRGC has been certainly publicly very careful to support the negotiators. Do any of you see any nefarious sort of motives on the part of the IRGC that they're afraid they're somehow going to lose their hold on the economy? If a deal goes through?
I think it comes down to what we also already said about how quickly a deal can change the situation on the ground, if there were one. My understanding is that ultimately the decision, with all the factions taken into account, will be done in the interest of the system, and that goes beyond individual beneficiaries within the IRGC of counterfeiting and smuggling, etc. So while it's always an interesting thing to point at that there are vested interests in Iran in having and keeping the sanctions, I don't see them as being decisive. They will not keep up, and they haven't. I mean, the whole idea of getting to these agreements where we are and keep on negotiating builds on the eventuality of a comprehensive agreement. So there may be individual interests against that, but it's not going to hold the whole country at ransom.
Cliff, yeah, I want you to comment on that, but also, the internal political situation. There will be parliamentary elections coming up, and elections for the Assembly of Experts and so on. How does that play in as well?
Well, first, I personally do think the IRGC is an obstacle. They're an obstacle to monitoring, inspection, monitoring, and verification. They've actively opposed the regime. And there's a theory out there that Iranians articulate, which to me is not crazy. I mean, the leader would rather have, a series of deals, what I call JPOA forever. And I'd like to come back to that before we, finish, Barbara. But in that scenario, Khamenei doesn't really have to choose. He can kind of muddle through on his economy, but he doesn't have to put up with U.S. and European firms that will just knock the IRGC out of the market. So he can keep his cronies, but have at least a meaningful opening in the Iranian economy. And that may be the way he thinks about splitting the baby here. What's interesting about the Majlis elections, anyway, the Assembly of Experts is a much more murky. I think the Assembly of Experts election will end up. I mean, my own view from everything I'm hearing is that Mr. Shahroudi will be the next chairman and will be the odds-on favorite to be the next leader. And we could do worse, meanwhile. but you know, he's close to Rafsanjani. I think he's marginally more open-minded than the current leader. And I think he's quite strong. But that'll be a heavily vetted election, and I don't think very typical or representative of what's going on in Iran. What's interesting about the Majlis elections is they're already starting, which is, you know, Iranian elections start 2 weeks before the election. This is really, 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 really interesting and unique. And you've got this broad kind of pro-Rouhani bloc that extends from traditional conservatives like Natak Nouri to Khatami, which is an extraordinary bloc. I think what hangs in the balance, though, is where the traditional conservatives, Ali Larijani, the ones that really control the country with the Bazaris and run the Majlis and the Bazaar right now, where they end up. And I think that will largely be dictated by whether there's a deal or not. So I think that the complexion of the next Majlis and whether Rouhani is a one-term or two-term president so definitely still hangs in the balance. I don't think, I have a slightly different view than Cornelius. I think that if there's no deal, Rouhani is going to be very, very, very considerably weakened.
Do you agree, Cornelius?
Well, obviously we have slightly different views. I don't think that Iran will be, I mean, it will certainly not be prosperous if there is no deal. What I was saying is that the regime has hedged its bets, even for a no-deal scenario. Certainly to the extent that, I mean, we don't know what will happen to the economic side, and certainly when they entered this, they were expecting, for example, a higher oil price. But in terms of the ideology, in terms of how they portray the whole deal, the whole negotiations, they being the supreme leader and the people closest to him, they have made preparations for the no-deal scenario. They will blame the U.S. for being intransigent. They will blame the U.S. for scuttering a deal. They will try to drive a wedge into the Europeans and into the whole P5+1. They want to get Russia on board. They are playing, the Iranians are actively playing the Russian card. You said rightly there is not yet much of a deal had with Russia, but the whole public image of Iran approaching Russia and being on good relations with it is meant to open up an alternative. Of course, Iranians would want European companies to go back, and even Americans, but ostensibly they say that we can do also with Russian and Chinese companies or Indian companies. So there is a psychological element to this. This is how I see it. I'm not saying that if there is no deal, Iran is going to be good, well off. Yeah.
Any more questions out here? Yeah.
Can I ask a specific question in follow-up to that?
Sure. Wait for the if you'd wait for the microphone, please. Yeah.
No, the microphone.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you.
Chris Dugan. Then Rosatom has a vested interest in this deal, either way. Now, Rosatom, from what I know, is Putin's baby, and he wants to spread Rosatom worldwide technology, selling Rosatom reactors. So the deal doesn't work out. Iran turns towards Rosatom to a larger extent to develop its nuclear capability, potentially question. And if it does work out, what happens then?
They buy more reactors from Rosatom.
Rosatom. So it's a win-win for Russia on this and Rosatom.
Do you agree?
Yes? Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, but I mean, Rosatom is, I don't really think that that's all, you know, that's kind of good. I mean, you know, in my view, though they won't say it publicly, they'll kind of imply it, the U.S. administration kind of likes this kind of 8 more reactors because it undermines the practical needs argument of Iran. What the hell do you need, you know, to enrich your own fuel for if Russia's going to give it to you forever? And they have, you know, a robust nuclear energy program coming, and they don't have to have an industrial scale enrichment program. Look, I mean, there's a very strong non-proliferation streak in Russian foreign policy. Putin does not want a nuclear weapons-armed Iran. Putin does not want a war in his backyard led by Israel and the United States bombing Iran. He really doesn't want it. You know, I've heard him say that. He really doesn't want it. And I think they're not doing us a favor. Everybody here thinks the Russians are doing us a favor. People, they're not doing us a favor. They're pursuing Russian national interests. And so, you know, deal or no deal, I actually, you know, think it's in the U.S. interest to have Rosatom just go wild in Iran because the fuel all comes back. I mean, they're not going to let them keep the fuel. So I actually think the Russians, that doesn't worry me.
Alan, wait for the mic.
Alan Kieswetter with Denton's and with MEI. And it's sort of commonly accepted that a bad deal was worse than no deal, and this seems obvious. But under what circumstances is no deal worse than the alternatives? What has to change? There could be a good deal, which I think Cliff sort of outlined, but what about all these other factors you've laid out there that might make maintaining a no-deal status not very good?
I can think of a lot of reasons why a no deal is the worst of, is one of the worst. I mean, if there is no deal, if there is an open break and people walk away from these talks, Iran resumes enriching uranium to 20% and beyond. And then we have all the concerns about them actually going for a bomb. And there is a small constituency in Iran that says, you know, let's just get it over with and get the bomb, and then people will respect us, and sanctions will actually come off. And we also have concerns that the Israelis, again, would start to you know, make noises about taking action. So it certainly would destabilize the region even further, which is the last thing it needs. I don't know if anybody else would want to add to that. I mean, this sort of JPOA forever, I like that, Joint Plan of Action forever, certainly seems superior to no deal. I think everybody on this panel would agree.
Well, I just want to add that the discourse is about to change, or has been changing over the past year. Whereas when we just had the JPOA, of course, it was criticized for being a deal where then one shouldn't make a deal. But it was meant to be short term, and there was this idea that this should be quickly negotiated into a comprehensive deal. Right now, we have a situation where whoever fails to live up to at least the minimum standard that we have will be regarded as the one party scuttling whatever was possible. So there is an incentive by either side, if we just look at two sides simplifying, there is an incentive to at least keep the status quo. So I think that the no deal scenario, which was at least a possibility before November 24th, and everyone was talking about it, and why it would be beneficial to at least keep the status quo. I think this becomes much more accepted. So the no deal as in complete failure, maybe hopefully or luckily, has become much less of a probability right now. So no deal will mean we keep what we have, and then it's not so bad, because you know this is what all sides seem to accept. But I'm less afraid of a complete failure at the moment than I was maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago.
Now, I would note that the title of this event was Breakthrough or Extension, so there was no third alternative listed. Yeah.
Well, you know, look, I mean, I think it's interesting. Nobody's asked about so far. None of us has commented on so far. You know what I kind of, you know, smirkily call JPOA forever. But you know, my own view is the intellectual community is ducking right now. In that nobody wants to talk about it. I think there's a good chance of a deal, but you know, the worst thing that could happen is there's no deal and we don't have a good plan B. Plan B is an Israeli strike. That's a horrible plan B. And I don't see much work being done on how JPOA, long-term JPOA, let's call it, JPOA plus. There's work to be done. I mean, look, we just got Iranian non-industrial development of the 2M, the 4, the 5, the 6, the 8. That's a big deal. The main problem with kind of this JPOA forever idea is sneak out. That what you really need, that is going to be very hard to get, is a centrifuge inventory, completely open production plants and production rates, additional protocol plus. It's difficult, but it's doable. What would the price be? How much sanctions relief would we have to be? I mean, what partial agreements might float and what might not float? I'm not there yet either, but I think it's incumbent on everyone. I mean, nobody can say there's going to be a deal. We obviously have been through a year now, there hasn't been a deal. And I think there's an intellectual kind of frontier there that we're just not piercing. So that's a thought.
Indeed. Yeah, gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Stefan Grob with Euronews European Television. Just following up on this, wouldn't a no-deal situation be worse for Iran than, for the rest? Obviously, we're in overtime now. We're headed for a penalty kick. And at the end, there must be something, right? We cannot just walk away from the table and then have nothing, whereas the Iranian people do suffer from these sanctions. I mean, let's not forget this. If you have a child in Iran and the child starts coughing, you can't get, to the next pharmacy and buy something because it's not there. If you have a car, a Western European car, and it's broken, you can't get a spare part. So life is really difficult. If from what you've said, it seems to me that you think the Iranian leadership will be the big winner if there is a no-deal situation. Don't you think that there is some sort of pressure, sort of domestic pressure to come up with something to get rid of this horrible situation that people are facing every day?
Yes, but not to the point where they would make concessions which they believe is against reason, logic, or dignity. So there is not enough pressure, and there maybe shouldn't be, or there couldn't be pressure that they will give in. They won't give in. They are negotiating, fighting, if you like, for what they consider a good deal, and this is maybe a deal they would strike at some point. We don't know. But what we do know is that they don't give in to what we think is a really good deal. They will not have that. They would rather continue with the situation. The peak of the sanctions was, in fact, in 2012, 2013 beginning. Since Rouhani has come to office, the situation has somewhat calmed, both in terms of psychological expectations and then the sanctions, the limited sanctions relief, which came with the interim agreement, which means that for the past 2 years, 1.5, 2 years, they've already stabilized to some extent. And they are banking on, if there is a failure of the talks, that there will also be a failure of the sanctions regime, because at some point, countries like Russia, China, South Korea, India, they may ask questions. Is it all because of US Congress that we get into this situation? Why don't we increase our trade with Iran? Because after all, we should not be beholden by the US legislative. So this is the expectations, or this is the scenario they are banking on when they think that they can live through a no-deal scenario.
I think I have one point to add to that, and it is the temperament for these other countries to go along. If you look at China, for example, you have Bank Kunlun, which is designated, which is carrying out the majority of the trade between Iran and China. At what point do we reach where a country says, all right, we're going to have this financial institution suffer the designation of U.S. sanctions so that we can facilitate this trade with Iran? If you look at the sanctions regimes, I mean, that's what they do. We always use the word froze or frozen or blocked, but that's not really what's occurring. What we're saying is there is exposure for designation if you engage in this type of activity. So at some point, the country can say, all right, bank XYZ, you're our bank for dealing with Iran. You're going to suffer. You're the bad bank, and you're going to suffer the consequences of the U.S. sanctions designation, but it's a necessary evil so that we can resume or increase trade ties with Iran. So that's always been my question in my mind. What is the appetite, and when is that going to occur?
China, of course, can make it worth the while of that bank and protect them so that they can carry on this trade. Sure. Yeah. I have a question about what happens with all the personnel changes. We've mentioned that there's a change in the European Union and their structure. Presumably, at some point, Catherine Ashton will depart the scene. Bill Burns has retired. He now has a non-State Department email. And he's taking up the head of Carnegie Endowment in February. Yes. Which was another reason why I thought there would be a deal, frankly, before then, because I thought Bill Burns would want to get this all sealed up, our Deputy Secretary of State. What will these changes mean? I mean, I assume Wendy Sherman will remain involved. She will stay the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and some of the other parties will remain the same. Does it matter that Bill Burns will depart? Does it matter that Catherine Ashton will depart? In terms of the psychology of the talks, so that's not important.
I don't think it matters that much. I mean, I think Bill Burns really matters. I mean, the 15 or 20 years I was in government, he was one of the 2 or 3 best diplomats I ever worked with. And that's a huge loss. But these are interest-based negotiations. I don't think the personalities matter all that much. Even Zarif, even charming Zarif. I think you can swap these guys in and out, and it's about SWU and it's about piping, and I don't think there's a major impetus. But Cornelius, maybe you have a different view.
I wish I could say Catherine Ashton mattered. I cannot. For the same reason, and objectively for the same reason that Cliff mentioned. But there is a debate at the moment going on in Brussels. The fact that there is a debate is already telling, because one could simply say personalities don't matter. We now have a new High Representative. It was obvious that we extended Catherine Ashton for the 24 days beyond her mandate. That was same with Bill Burns. So for a short-term period, you wouldn't want to change the team, which is about to finalize the deal. Now that we talk about months of extension, then it would make sense to have the new High Representative, because it is, in fact, the High Representative of the EU representing the P5+1. It's not Catherine Ashton ad personam. So the fact that this needs a debate in Brussels tells you something about that it's not so obvious, at least not for European member states. I take it that Federica Mogherini, she was chosen as not maybe for being not the strongest of foreign ministers. That's a pattern in European politics, unfortunately. And that's exactly the point. If she were to become the head of the talks now, or the convener, so to say, it would give her maybe more power than member states would want her to have. With Catherine Ashton, they know where they are. So this is a very unfortunate but intra-European debate about who should lead the talks. If she were to take it up, which you guess I hope she will, there may be a fresh approach also looking at the broader Iran file. What is beyond the nuclear? The European Union has lots of things to talk about with Iran, as does the US, but there is maybe more of an openness in Europe. So we could talk about the regional role of Iran. We could talk about the human rights situation. There used to be a human rights dialogue between the EU and Iran. This may all come to the fore if we have a change of personnel, but that's still an if.
Cliff, what do you think the Omanis are going to be doing to try to get this back on track? We haven't mentioned Oman, but of course this country has played an extremely important role in facilitating direct U.S.-Iran talks, and very important in terms of getting the interim agreement.
I think we've seen that movie. I think they have the advantage of being a country that both sides, they're an intermediary. There's a level of trust between both sides and the Omanis. It's unclear to me, look, there's been so many venues, so many months, so many discussions. I mean, I know a lot of these negotiators, you do too, Barbara, they're just bored. They show up every time, they have the same arguments. They could do the Iranian side by now. So I don't think it's a question of mediators or Omanis or, Liechtensteinians. I think it's political will on the Iranian side. And can the Obama administration carve out more space with the Congress? It's a plague on both sides. Both sides got to move here in order to get a deal. I think it's, it's kind of simple. It's not that simple. In a way, it's simple, okay? Let me
Describing it as simple.
All right. I think, a couple more minutes. Any last thoughts? Let me turn, please, Pani, one more question here.
My name is Pani.
Whoa, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Pani. I deal daily with trying to help U.S. companies sell their products into Iran and getting paid. Back to how you ended on the subject of sanctions removal. Let's say they come to an agreement with numbers. What are we agreeing to remove, and how are we going to handle the banking situation in the negotiations? And also there has been stories going around that Central Bank of Iran may be able to get a relief. Have you heard that? Is there any truth to that? You said Iran came to the table last year saying that they are okay with some sanctions, and now they come and say we want complete removal, plus the
UN.
UN.
Of UN sanctions.
Of UN. But are we willing to do that?
No.
No. How about complete removal of sanctions?
No.
How about banking?
Okay.
How are we going to ease
Yeah,
the banking?
it's been floated to me that as part of a comprehensive deal, there would be a direct banking channel between the U.S. and an Iranian bank. This has been floated as one of the incentives to the Iranians, but I assume...
Look, I mean, the things the Iranians want the most, their wish list is three. Cash, banking, and oil. They want their oil back on, they want their assets unfrozen, and they want their banks freed up. They want the SWIFT codes back. So I don't know any thing I shouldn't know, but it's my assumption that kind of relief would be relatively early on under any
The banking relief.
a limited amount of banking relief, which would not free up the Iranian economy to reconnect with the global economy, but would go 30, let's say, % of the way towards that, which would make it, which would make your life a little bit, but not a lot easier, I would say. But Eric, I'd love to hear what you think.
And that there might be some Iranian bank that would be, it would be announced that this bank is a clean bank that can be used, for example, for trade with the U.S.
Yes, go ahead. Eric.
Sure. Obviously, this idea, as you brought up, has been floated around. It's not a new idea. There has been in the past authorizations provided by Treasury for sanctioned banks to have direct banking relationships with the United States. I've seen those licenses before. There are, in other sanctions programs, Burma and Zimbabwe, there are general authorizations for U.S. persons to have authorized transactions with these designated banks. So this is not a new idea. Everyone I've talked to about this has been concerned about the optics. How does it look? And the whole thing is it's not being pitched right. It shouldn't be pitched as we are opening up a financial channel for Iran. It's we are restricting Iran's funds to flow through this financial channel, which is under our control and which we can monitor. And I'm probably beating a dead horse here, but I've brought up this point many times. The way the current system is set up, we're requiring foreign financial institutions to process transactions, and they don't want to touch it, right? So this leads Iran to getting inventive and using things like hawala brokers and the barter system, which makes money laundering much easier because it's harder to trace the transactions. So to answer your question, I think that a direct banking channel in one form or the other, or at least an authorization allowing U.S. banks to engage in some limited activity with banks that are blocked in Iran, maybe not the designated 13382 and 13224.
Banks that are designated for support of terrorism.
Sorry for getting too legalistic there, but the private banks which are blocked just by virtue of being part of the Iranian financial system, maybe there's some opportunities there.
Thank you. That was exactly what I was looking forward to hearing. And then I have a question. I'm sorry, I'm
Please.
taking over the microphone since I think I wanted to
Please.
wait till it last.
Okay.
Cornelius, with respect to European banking, Europeans have imposed their own sanctions on Iran. Since I've been doing business deals from the U.S. under OFAC licenses, we always have to go through a third bank in order to get, at the end of the day, our payments here. I have been hearing that there may be some ease on European banking sanctions. Is that correct?
Well, only as part of a deal, not...
Okay.
Well, there are purportedly a couple of banks in Switzerland that have been handling humanitarian trade.
Well, but that's what is allowed under the current system.
Yeah, that's what is allowed. I'm saying before the deal, 7 months, I have heard that some Europeans, in order to keep it going and keep the Iranians happy, some European banks may have the authorization to go ahead and ease some of their banking restrictions.
That's not what I have heard.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just wanted to, I'm just clarifying.
Can I just touch on this point?
Sure.
Because this drives me crazy. The JPOA offered sanctions relief in the form of a financial channel for humanitarian trade. This is trade that is generally authorized by the U.S. and exempted from sanctions legislation. So the idea that this is sanctions relief is absurd to me. It's not really relief. We're just saying, hey, we know that people aren't allowing you guys to do this, so we're going to call around. And I know Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi is one of the banks that is participating in that. Thank you for your SEC filings, which finally cleared up that mystery for us. But this is not really sanctions relief. So if I'm sitting in the Iranian position, I want something that's more tangible in form of actual relief and actual concession on that, other than you're going to help us do that which is already authorized. That's just my...
Judging from the horror stories I've heard, to simply have people allowed to do that which is already authorized is already a big leap. Funny, you had one more comment.
Sorry, this is my last question.
Okay.
And it has to do with banking relief. We know that there's a lot of lawsuits pending. A lot of lawsuits that have been going on, and their court decisions to go after Iranian government money. It has to do with previous actions of terrorism that has been claimed that Iranian government was behind it. If there is a relief on banking transactions, let's say Central Bank of Iran, which is a government-owned bank, how do we get around that in order to ensure that the money that comes for the trade is actually safe and secure? I would like Eric to answer that.
That's a very good question. People may know that there are suits against the Central Bank of Iran for Iranian support for acts that led to the deaths of Americans in Israel, for example, or the Beirut bombing of 1983, which is attributed to Hezbollah, which was supported by Iran.
So one of the things in sanctions world that we never say is, how do we get around something? How do we got to always work within the legal frameworks, otherwise you get into a question of evasion. How do you address the situation? It's a very good question. I think certainly the plaintiffs' lawyers who have been going after Iran for all of these years, and I've worked on these cases in relation to Iraq, not necessarily in relation to Iran, are very creative. We've seen how they've lobbied Congress to get to be able to obtain payment for the judgments they've received in U.S. district courts. And I don't really have a solid answer as to how do you address that, because these plaintiffs' lawyers, in my opinion, will be able to go to Congress, and the atmosphere is right there, convince them to put in a provision like they did in the Threat Reduction Act, which directly addresses some litigation that's ongoing and payment of the judgment of government of Iran proceeds. Take that in connection with the fact that now the entire Iranian financial system is blocked under Executive Order 13599, and it's basically been equated to being a part of the government of Iran. I think some strong arguments could be made by those plaintiff lawyers. So it's a very good question, a very tricky question to answer and to address.
In short, we will have many things to discuss going forward, no matter what happens in the nuclear talks. So I want to thank my speakers, and thank you all for coming out on a rainy day, and hope we will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.